Cadet Mira stood at the entrance of the Intergalactic Academy classroom, her armor humming softly with every breath. She took the metal plates covering her from head to toe gleamed under the cold light above her boots, heavy with dust left faint. Prints on the clean floor, and her helmet showed no emotion, no face, just silence. The room was already full of students, most of them not humans, sitting in curved rows around a floating whiteboard. Some had tails, some had horns, and some glowed faint blue light from their skin, but none wore armor. None looked like they were ready for war. As Mira stepped in, every head turned. Their conversations stopped. A few chuckled quietly, some whispered, and one alien with 4 eyes near the front made a loud, fake gasp, saying, "Look at that, a walking tank in literature class." His voice dripped with sarcasm, and others laughed along. Mira said nothing. She kept walking slowly with the same quiet rhythm, metal tapping against metal as her armor joints moved. Her movements smooth and practiced, like someone who had worn the suit for years, not hours. She walked past rows of desks, ignoring the stares, her helmet scanning and adjusting the display inside, finding her assigned seat at the far back corner of the room. Instructor Vex looked up from the hollow board, his long green neck craning forward, his wide black eyes narrowing. He was a rigid teacher, a veteran of peace talks between species, and proud of the Academy's peaceful traditions. Mira, he said sharply, "Is there a reason you are in full combat gear inside an educational space?" Mira stopped and turned her head slightly toward him. Her voice came through the helmet speaker, clear but soft. "Yes, sir," she said. "The armor is for my safety and comfort." "Sir, safety?" Vex repeated loudly. "Safety from what? We are not in a battlefield here. We are in a place of knowledge and peace." Mira stayed quiet for a second, then said again, "It is for my safety, sir." Laughter bubbled up again, this time from the left side of the room. A creature with wings folded behind her back muttered, "Maybe she thinks the books will shoot her or the math problems will explode." More laughter followed, and one student near the front whispered loudly, "Maybe humans can't read without a helmet." Mira stood still, absorbing every word. Without movement, she did not answer. She simply lowered herself into the seat at the back. The metal creaked slightly as her armor bent, her hands resting quietly on the desk. They too were armored gloves, shaped perfectly for her fingers, but rough with burn marks and scratches. No one noticed, yet the students looked back at the front, still chuckling, and Vex returned to the lesson, swiping his three-fingered hand through the air to bring up a hologram of ancient Terran poetry. The lines floated midair, glowing softly, but Myra's presence continued to draw attention. Eyes kept flicking back to her, as if her armor was louder than her voice, as if the very weight of it filled the room with noise. 15 minutes past, the lesson crawled forward, but the mood had changed. None of the students could focus. They were too distracted by the armored human who said nothing and did nothing, just sat and listened through a helmet visor that hid everything, a mystery made of metal and silence. Vex finally stopped. He turned again, his tone more serious. "Now, Mira," he said, "I must insist you remove your armor. This is a classroom, not a bunker." Mira did not move. The room grew quiet. Again, the students leaned forward, waiting, some expecting a protest, others waiting for a show of defiance. Mira stood slowly, her chair sliding back with a screeching sound, loud and sharp. She walked to the front, her steps echoing again. Everyone watching. Vex raised an eyebrow, confused, then nodded. Mira stopped at the center of the room. She said softly, "If I remove the armor, then you will see why I wear it. I am not trying to disturb the peace. I am protecting myself from the past." Vex crossed his arms, but said nothing. Permission given was already clear. Mira reached up and released the locks on her helmet. The small hiss of air escaping filled the silence. The helmet came off slowly. Her hair underneath, short and dark, clung to her skin from sweat and heat, but that was not what caught their eyes. Her face was marked with deep red scars, old burn wounds running down from her temple to her cheek. The right side of her face was stiff, unmoving, like nerves were long dead. One of her eyes was artificial, a glowing, dull orange lens that whirred slightly as it focused on them. The class gasped loudly, and the room felt colder suddenly. Without a word, she removed her chest plate. The armor clanged softly on the floor beneath. It was a tight gray suit, but parts were torn and faded. Her neck and collarbone showed more scars, not fresh, but deep and angry, telling stories of flames and pain. She removed one glove, then the other. Her fingers were uneven. One hand looked partly rebuilt with synthetic skin and metal knuckles. One of the alien students near the front quickly looked away, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't. Mira stood there, still silent, her breathing steady, her shoulders straight. She did not cry, she did not speak, her scars spoke for her. Every line and melted patch on her skin told a story that none of them had ever heard. None of them wanted to believe. Instructor Vex opened his mouth, but found no words. His voice had failed him just like the jokes had failed the students. Mira looked at them all slowly, one by one, meeting every set of eyes with her single glowing one. Her voice came low and steady. When you laugh at my armor, you laugh at my survival. When you ask me to remove it, you ask me to show you pain I did not choose. When you joke about safety, you show me you have never known real danger. The class was silent. Not one voice dared rise, not one smile dared appear. Mira walked slowly back to her seat, each step heavy and loud with meaning, her helmet in one hand and her scars uncovered. No one laughed now, no one whispered, no one dared breathe too loud. She sat again, her armor beside her, her face uncovered, her truth exposed. And finally they saw her, not as a joke, not as a soldier, but as a survivor. And for the first time in that class they listened. The silence in the room stretched like a shadow across the floor. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. The students sat frozen, their eyes still fixed on the human girl who had just revealed her face, her scars, her story. Mira sat in her seat, her armor resting beside her, her breathing steady, her hands calm, her glowing. I scanned the classroom slowly, every movement measured like a machine built for survival. Her real I was tired, but it held something more, something heavy and unspoken. A weight that no textbook could carry. Instructor Vex shifted uncomfortably at the front of the class. His fingers twitched as he looked down at the glowing display of human poetry still hanging in the air. The words seemed pointless, now hollow phrases with no meaning next to what had just happened. He cleared his throat. The sound cracked through the room like dry lightning. Mira, he said carefully, you did not need to show all this. But Mira interrupted gently, I did need to. They laugh because they do not know, they mock because they have forgotten what it means to be afraid. I do not blame them, I blame the silence. One of the alien students near the middle of the room slowly raised a hand. His voice was soft and full of guilt. What happened to you? He asked. Mira turned to face him, the glow of her artificial eye catching the faint light from the ceiling. I was 10 years old, she said. My colony was called HFY 9. We were told the war was far away. We believed it. We studied, we played, we slept without fear. And then the sky broke. Some students leaned forward, drawn into her words, their curiosity replacing their discomfort. Her voice was steady, but each word carried weight, like ash falling from a dead fire. She continued, they came without warning. We still do not know which species led the strike. It was fast, it was brutal. They burned our fields first, then our homes, our hospitals, our schools. They called it a cleansing. They said we were a mistake, a stain on their maps. I do not remember their faces. I remember the fire. Her hand touched her cheek, where the deepest scar lay like a river frozen in place. I pulled my little brother out of our house. She said the roof was gone, the air was thick. I could not see, but I heard him screaming, and I followed his voice. I carried him through the smoke, my legs burning, my skin melting, my lungs choking. And then I passed out. I woke up 2 weeks later on a ship surrounded by strangers. My brother did not make it. No one moved, no one breathed. A winged alien covered her mouth, her eyes wide, and what another student wiped his face quickly, hoping no one would see. Myra's voice did not shake, but her eyes flickered with pain. I was left behind after the rescue teams came. Only the healthy were moved to Earth. The rest of us were forgotten, labeled unfit for reintegration. I was not strong enough to fight then, so I learned how to survive. I built my own armor from broken pieces of old suits. I trained alone, I studied alone. And then when I was ready, I applied to this academy. Vex stepped forward slowly, his voice quieter than before. Mira, no record of this was in your file. She turned toward him. There is no record because no one wanted to keep one, she said with sharp honesty. HFY 9 was declared lost with full casualties. No one wanted to admit survivors were left behind. It would have meant someone failed, and no one here likes that word. Another student spoke, this time from the back row, his voice hesitant but clear. I thought the war ended before I was born. I thought it was history. Mira shook her head. War does not end when the last shot is fired. It ends when the last memory stops hurting, and that has not happened yet. The class fell into silence again, but this time it was not empty. It was full of thoughts, full of questions, full of new understanding. Mira leaned forward, her hands clasped lightly, her voice lower, but still clear. I do not wear armor because I expect danger. I wear it because I remember what happens when you do not expect it. I wear it for those who never got the chance to. Zarn, the four-eyed alien, who had laughed the loudest earlier, looked down at his hands, shame heavy on his face. He finally spoke. I thought you were Trying to get attention? I thought you were just trying to stand out. I did not know. Mira looked at him. I know you did not know, she said. That is the problem. Vex stepped back and looked over the class, his eyes scanning faces that were no longer amused, no longer distracted. Every student had changed in those few minutes. Something quiet had settled into their minds, something real and uncomfortable. He spoke with care. This lesson was meant to cover early Terran literature about grief and loss, but I believe we have just seen something far more powerful than words. He turned to Mira and gave a small, respectful nod. You have taught them something more than I ever could. Mira nodded back, not out of pride, but out of duty. She had carried the truth. For too long, she had worn it on her skin and in her bones, and now finally someone had seen it. The bell rang soft and echoing through the halls, but no one moved, not at first. Slowly, the students began to rise, gathering their things, their eyes still lingering on Mira. Some approached quietly, not to ask questions, not to offer sympathy, but just to be near her, to show they were listening, now to show they understood at least a little. Zarn waited until the room emptied before walking up to her. His voice quiet, but firm. I want to know more, he said, not because I have to, but because I should. Mira looked up at him, her real, I tired, her cybernetic one steady. If you want to hear the truth, she said, you must be ready to carry it with you always. Zarn nodded. I am. Mira stood again, her armor pieces still lying next to her. But for now, she did not need them. The scars had spoken, the silence had ended, and the truth had finally found ears willing to hear. The day after the armor came off, the academy halls buzzed with quiet whispers, not loud, not mocking, but cautious, curious words carried from class to class across different species and languages. They spoke of the human girl with the glowing eye and burned skin who wore a soldier's armor, not for fashion, not for status, but because it was the only thing that made her feel whole, safe. Honest students who had laughed the day before now lowered their voices when Mira passed. Others simply stepped aside, watching her with wide, unsure eyes, like seeing a ghost that still walked and breathed. Mira moved through the corridors the same way she had done before, her steps steady, her posture strong, her armor now carried in a secure pack behind her, not worn, but never far away. Her hair pulled tight, her expression blank, but her eyes both real and artificial, always watching, always scanning. She knew these looks. She had seen them before, on soldiers, on survivors, on people who stared not out of hate, but out of disbelief, confusion, guilt. She entered her next class, a xenohistory seminar taught by Professor Elry, a slow-talking aquatic being who preferred facts over emotions, who measured knowledge in timelines and treaties. Mira took her usual seat near the back. Some students turned to glance, others turned away. Elry did not acknowledge her presence directly, but his eyes, small and clear and sunken deep in his head, lingered an extra second before beginning the lecture. Today, we discussed the Helion conflict, he said without emotion, pulling up floating images of battlefields, charred buildings, and colony maps. Mira felt a tightening in her chest as the screen showed a burning planet covered in clouds of ash and falling debris. Her fingers clenched lightly, the fire in her memory rising like it had never left. According to our records, Elry continued, the conflict ended in year 71 of galactic peace, with minimal civilian casualties on both sides. The treaty was signed with 5 major empires, and peacekeeping forces were deployed within 2 standard cycles. Mira raised her hand before she could stop herself, her voice calm but sharp. That record is wrong. Elry paused, the images still glowing in the air. Students turned again, their eyes flicking between the professor and the girl in the back. Mira stood slowly, her legs firm, her spine straight. Helion 9 did not see peacekeeping forces for nearly a year, and the damage was not minimal. The cities were destroyed, the survivors scattered. Most medical ships never came. The ones that did chose who lived and who was left behind. Elry blinked slowly, his webbed fingers tapping at the edge of his data pad. Mira walked forward, the images shifting as her presence disrupted the hollow field. She pointed to a cluster of ruins labeled Civilian Sector B. This building was my school, she said. This crater was our hospital. My mother died there. This region marked as uninhabited is where I was pulled from. The rubble, with one working leg and no skin left on half my body. The room held its breath. Mira continued, my scars are not battle decorations. They are census errors, memory holes, mistakes hidden behind words like minor or unconfirmed or unofficial. She turned to face the class, her eyes sharp. No one in this room did that to me, but everyone in this room believes in the lie that did. A student near the center, a feline humanoid with sharp stripes and soft eyes, spoke up, her voice uncertain but honest. What can we do about it? We cannot change what happened. Mira looked at her. You cannot change the past, But you can stop pretending it was clean, you can speak it right, you can remember it. Without filters, you can carry the truth. So the next time someone says war is noble, you know Betterelry stepped forward, clearing his throat and adjusting the projection. He gave Mira a nod before speaking softly. Cadet Mira, if you are willing, I would like you to speak again tomorrow during the interspecies history panel. We will discuss ground-level realities from the war, and I believe your story is one that must be heard. Mira gave a small nod and returned to her seat. That night in her quarters, Mira removed the last layers of armor from her body. Her arms covered in thin scars and new synthetic skin, she sat alone in the dim-lighted data screen open in front of her. She read through old news articles written by people who had never stepped foot on Helion 9, who had never smelled burning plastic and flesh mixed in the same air. She read comments full of praise for peace deals and negotiations, no words for the children pulled from ash, no lines for the wounded carried on broken doors, no mention of how survivors were left in silence because telling their story would mean admitting failure. Mira stared at her reflection in the glass, half metal, half skin, half memory, half machine. She had come to the academy not for fame or rank, but because the truth deserved to sit in the light. Just once, just long enough to be known by someone other than the broken. The next day arrived, and the interspecies history panel gathered in the large hall. Dozens of students, faculty, and visitors filled the seats. Mira stood near the stage dressed, not in armor, but in the academy uniform, sleeves rolled up, revealing the scars. She no longer hid the microphone, waited, but she did not use it. She spoke from her place, standing tall, her voice strong enough to reach the back of the room. I was 10. When I learned what a starship bombing sounds like, she began. I was 10 when I learned that pain could last for years and silence could last even longer. I was 10 when they told me I was one of the lucky ones, but no one stayed to help the unlucky ones. My name is Mira, and I am not a soldier. I am a memory that refuses to be buried. She told them about the days in the ruins, about searching for food in buildings still smoldering, about covering her brother with her own burned body to keep him warm, about waking up to find him cold and still and knowing no help was coming. She told them about the choice to stop crying and start surviving, the choice to build armor from scrap, the choice to walk into the academy carrying every scar like a flag. When she finished, no one clapped, not at first, no one moved. They simply sat in silence, not out of awkwardness, but out of respect, the kind that does not need sound to be real. Then slowly, as Mira stepped back, someone stood, then another, then a third, until the room was full of people, rising, not cheering, just standing with her, because that was all they could do, and sometimes that was enough. Later that evening, as Mira walked through the campus, the sun setting across the distant glass towers, Zarn walked beside her, quiet, thoughtful, his eyes not full of pity, but something else, something like understanding. You know, he said softly, I used to think scars meant weakness. Mira replied, they mean survival, and nothing survives without a story. Zarn nodded, and they kept walking side by side. No laughter, no whispers, just steps moving forward into a world that now carried one more truth. Days turned to weeks, and Myra's presence in the academy shifted from strange to silent, from mystery to meaning, from armored outsider to something deeper, something the students could not name, but could not ignore either. Her words had reached them. Her scars had etched themselves into their memory, not as horror, but as warning, and as truth. The laughter was gone, and so were the whispers. Now there was only space around her, space filled with thought. She walked through the marble halls, not as a ghost, but as something between legend and warning, a living chapter from a book no one wanted to read, yet now could not stop thinking about. Her name floated through study groups and debates. Her face, no longer hidden behind metal, had become a quiet symbol of what war left behind, not numbers, not medals, but scars. Instructor Vex had changed too. His lectures no longer clung to neat timelines or filtered reports. Now he invited voices, stories, real accounts from those who lived through the things books tried to simplify. Mira often stayed after class, speaking not to impress, but to explain, because now they asked questions not out of curiosity, but out of need. They needed to understand what they had ignored for too long. One day, a message came through the Academy network, a simple line requesting Myra's presence at the head council chamber. Her eyes scanned the text twice, reading the name of the sender, High Counselor Rel of the Galactic Peace Assembly. She closed the message and sat in silence, her armor still packed, her uniform clean, her breath steady. But something deeper stirred inside her, something not fear, not doubt, but wait, the kind that comes before storms. The chamber was carved from ancient stone, older Then most worlds in the system, a place where peace was written not just in words, but in echoes. Mira entered flanked by glass pillars that shimmered with the energy of past declarations. Her steps made no sound, but still carried presence. The council waited, a group of 10 beings, each from a different race, their robes marked with symbols of diplomacy, their eyes studying her with careful calm. Counselor Rel, a tall figure wrapped in layers of silk and shadow, spoke. First, Cadet Mira, you have brought forward claims that challenge our official records. Your personal experience contradicts historical accounts and classified reports. We ask now that you present your evidence and your truth for official review. Mira stood straight, her gaze even. She held nothing in her hands, no data pads, no charts, just memory and voice. She began with names of those left behind, names that never made it to the records, names erased by fear of accountability. She recited locations not on maps, shelters, and ruins she had lived in with others forgotten. She described supply drops that never came, transmissions never answered, medships that flew overhead without landing. She spoke not fast, not slow, but steady, like fire burning at just the right pace. The council listened, some nodded, others scribbled notes, and one, a reptilian diplomat named Cervic, looked away when she described the sound of her brother's last breath beneath a collapsed ceiling. Mira ended her testimony with a simple question, one that cut through every layer of protocol and politics. If the records are complete, then where are the voices of those who lived what your reports call peace? I call silence. A long pause followed, the weight of her words hanging like thick fog in the air. Counselor Rel spoke again. Your request to revise official records is a serious matter. Mira nodded. I do not ask for edits. I ask for inclusion, not for my sake, but for every student who studies a lie without knowing it. They dismissed her with formal bows and distant eyes, but she knew something had cracked, not shattered, but cracked, and sometimes that was enough. Back at the academy, changes began to form, slow but visible. Textbooks were updated to include first-hand accounts, memory archives were opened, students were encouraged to speak to survivors, not just read about them. Mira was invited to classrooms she once sat in quietly, now standing at the front, sharing more than scars, sharing meaning. Yet not all were pleased. Voices rose in resistance, whispers returned, but not of laughter, this time of accusation. Some called her a weapon of guilt, a living tool of shame forced into classrooms. Others said her story was exaggerated, her pain a performance for sympathy. One message left on her door said, we remember the war as victory, not failure. Stop poisoning peace. Mira read it and folded it in half. Without a word, Zarn found her that evening sitting under the statue of the Academy founders, her armor beside her untouched. Since the council hearing, he sat beside her, quiet until the silence became soft, not empty. He said, some people are afraid of truth because it's heavier than lies. Mira nodded without looking at him. I do not need everyone to believe me. I just need them to know I exist. The next morning, she arrived in class early, sitting at her desk alone until the seats began to fill slowly. Students entered carrying books, data screens, and a new kind of energy, one not of fear, but readiness. Zarn took the seat next to her, then the winged girl from the poetry class, then two others, even the striped feline, who once stared without words, sat nearby. Instructor Vex entered and paused, noticing the shift, then smiled slightly as he opened the day's lesson. He looked at the students and then at Mira. Today, he said, we discussed truth and why it matters more than tradition. He turned to the board where the word truth floated bright and large, and below it a smaller line was written, scars are not weakness, they are memory written in flesh. Mira smiled a little, and for the first time, she felt something different, not relief, not victory, but connection. Later that week, she stood before another gathering, this time the Academy's entrance hall, full of visiting families, new recruits, and ambassadors. She had not planned to speak, but the dean had asked her personally, said, your story changed this place. We need them to know what it means to belong here. So she stood again, without armor, without notes, her voice echoing across the glass ceiling. I was not welcomed when I arrived. I was questioned, mocked, misunderstood, but I was not broken because I had already been broken before I came here, and I built myself again piece by piece. I did not come here to teach, but to survive, and now I see those are the same thing. She stepped down, no applause, just silence, then slow, respectful nods and eyes that held depth, not sympathy, but recognition. That night, she walked the outer garden of the Academy. Stars burning above in patterns she had memorized long ago, patterns she once watched from beneath rubble, wishing to see them again. She stopped at a small tree, planted near the edge, new and still fragile. A tag hung from it, Helion 9 Memorial. Growth Mira reached out and touched the bark soft and alive, not yet strong, but growing, and for the first time in years, she closed her eyes not from pain, but peace star. The sun over the academy rose slow and wide, bathing the upper towers in light that felt warmer than usual though the temperature never changed. And though the gravity field stayed balanced, something in the air had shifted not in science, but in spirit. Students walked slower, some walked together, who once avoided each other. Whispers that used to float like knives now moved like threads, stitching understanding in places where division had lived for years. The name Mira was no longer followed by laughter or questions. Now it carried weight, and not the kind that sinks, but the kind that stands inside the hall of collective studies. The day's lecture was about planetary rebuilding efforts after the war, a subject once taught with charts and success rates and percentages of soil recovery, but today it was different because Mira had been asked to lead the opening words, not as a student, not as a guest, but as a witness. Her scars no longer hidden, her voice no longer quiet. She stood before her classmates, some who once mocked her, some who now sat straight with open ears. The hologram beside her showed an image of Helion 9, not from orbit, not from records, but from her own memory. Burned buildings, collapsed tunnels, crumbled hospitals cracked open like eggs in the sun. Mira stood still and said, the first truth of the hour: rebuilding is not about the ground, it is about the people. And sometimes the people do not return to the surface, sometimes they stay buried even when they are still breathing. A silence followed that was not empty, it was heavy with thought and pain and respect, the kind of silence that made every word that followed more real. Instructor Vex stepped in after Mira finished, and for the first time in that course, he deleted 3 slides from his lesson plan in front of the whole class, saying, only we no longer need these. Someone already told it better later. That day, Mira sat alone at the reflection pool, a calm square of still water where students went to think or to be quiet or to simply watch the light play across the surface. She sat without her armor, her hands in her lap, her legs crossed, her face calm, her eyes scanning the water, not for danger, but for memory. The image of her brother flickered there, not as a ghost, not as a spirit, just as a shape her mind refused to erase. Zarn approached slow, his footsteps soft, as if afraid to disturb the quiet, but Mira spoke before he could. You are not disturbing anything, she said. You are part of the silence now too. He sat beside her, careful, his wings folded tight, his hands holding a data pad. I found something, he said, in the archives, a report buried beneath 50 access codes, a memo from the Peace Commission about Helion 9. Mira turned slightly, her interest quiet but sharp, and he continued, it says survivors were recorded, but the list was deleted from public view. The reason marked as error correction. Mira nodded slowly and said softly, they wanted a clean war story, not a true one. Zarn passed the data pad to her, the text glowing softly. She did not cry, she had done that already in silence and smoke and pain. Now she read with the calm of someone who expected nothing and yet still hoped for change. The names on the list were familiar, not all, but someone, especially her brother's name spelled wrong, but they're listed among the removed, marked deceased. Without confirmation, Mira whispered his name into the wind, not to call him back, but to remind the universe he had existed. That night, she stood before the Academy Council again, not by invitation this time, but by choice. She entered the chamber with a single line written in her hand, a request not for justice, not for revenge, but for record. She spoke clear and without anger. I asked that the names of the Helion 9 survivors be restored to the Peace Archive, not because they need it, but because history does, because a galaxy that hides its scars forgets how they happened and then repeats them. Counselor Rel did not speak at first, nor did the others, but they listened not as leaders, but as people who now understood that decisions made in orbit had left fire in the dirt below. They voted silently, and the screen in the chamber blinked once, then twice, and then displayed the names of the forgotten, restored, and permanent. Mira bowed once and left, saying nothing more. The following week, a surprise announcement spread across the student network. A new seminar titled Memory in Ashwood be offered, led by survivors of the Helion conflict, including guest sessions from Mira herself. Enrollment reached maximum capacity. Within hours, the Academy had to create a waiting list, something never done before for a human-led session. Mira prepared her first lecture not with notes, but with items: a burned journal, a melted toy, a piece of her first handmade armor. These were her teaching tools, not diagrams, not theories, but fragments of real life. Students sat in silence as she placed each object on the table and then began. Each one of these was a moment, She said, "A moment I chose to keep, so I would never forget, and now I share them with you, so you will not forget either." The students took notes, but not just on pads, they took notes in their hearts, their expressions no longer full of distance or disbelief. Now, they carried the same look Mira had worn when she first walked into the academy, guarded but open, heavy but standing, honest. Weeks passed, and Mira became more than a name. She became a chapter in the culture of the school. She did not seek attention, but attention came when truth is spoken. It echoes without force. Her presence brought changes, not loud ones, but deep ones. The curriculum adjusted, the archives updated, survivors invited to speak, messages once sealed now unlocked. Small things, but powerful. One morning, as Mira walked to class, she saw a young alien cadet standing by the statue of the Peace Guardians, wearing something strange, a piece of chest armor made from scrap painted with the Helion crest. It was clearly homemade, rough, but worn with pride. Mira approached, and the cadet turned wide-eyed and nervous. "I read your file," she said. "I read all the reports and your stories, and I just wanted to carry a piece of that strength with me." Mira looked at the armor, then at the cadet, then said with a quiet smile, "Strength is not in the armor, it is in the choice to wear it even when you do not have to." Later that evening, Mira visited the Helion 9 tree again. The one planted at the edge of the academy grounds. It had grown taller, its leaves thicker, its trunk stronger. She placed a small stone at its base with her brother's name carved into it, the right way, not the way the records had it, not the way the reports erased it. She stood for a long time, watching as the wind moved the leaves gently, like they were whispering back. As stars began to rise and the academy lights dimmed, Mira walked slowly back to her room. Her armor still hung by the door, untouched for days, not because she no longer needed it, but because now she knew when to wear it and when not to. The armor had protected her body, but truth had protected her soul, and now she walked not just as a survivor, but as a voice that could not be silenced, not by war, not by fire, not by shame. And the academy would never be the same again. A new cycle had begun at the academy, and with it came fresh recruits, wide-eyed, full of hope, and unaware of the history layered into the walls. They walked past. Mira stood on the upper balcony, watching them arrive, each face a blank slate, each step unaware of the weight of what had come before. The uniforms were crisp, their boots clean, their questions loud and eager. She remembered her own first day, the whispers, the stares, the laughter, and the quiet pain that followed. She had not come to inspire, she had come to survive, but survival had carved something stronger in her path. The tree planted for Helion 9 now stood as tall as any flagpole, its branches stretching like arms, no longer fragile, no longer trembling in the wind. Beside it stood a plaque with names burned into metal, not in memory of the dead, but in honor of the living. Mira visited it often, not out of sorrow, but out of duty. She traced the lines with her fingers and remembered the way her brother laughed with his eyes closed and how the sun looked before the sky caught fire. She did not cry anymore. Her tears had run dry long ago. Now, she only carried the silence and the story. One morning during a quiet meal in the academy commons, a tall shadow fell across her table. It was Instructor Vex, holding a sealed letter, its seal marked with the crest of the Galactic Peace Assembly. Mira took it without a word and opened it slowly. The message was short, an invitation not to speak, not to testify, but to teach. A full-cycle lecture series at the Central Assembly campus on the human experience of war and recovery. Her scars were now seen, not as reminders of suffering, but as sources of truth. Mira looked up at Vex, who nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving her to the decision alone. She accepted the offer without hesitation, because truth once spoken cannot be put back in the dark. The assembly campus was vast, polished, and cold, filled with the kind of voices that spoke in polite tones and debated numbers over pain. Mira entered her first lecture with nothing but her old armor and a data crystal inside the room. Students from across the galaxy sat with notepads, hovering screens, and curious faces. Some looked at her like a puzzle, some like a relic, others like a challenge. She said nothing at first. Instead, she laid the pieces of her armor on the table one by one, then turned to face them all. This armor is not protection, it is memory, it is fear turned to steel, it is hope held together by bolts. It is what I wore when no one else stood for me, and what I kept when the noise died down and silence became my only voice. She paused, letting the words sink into the walls and into the hearts of those listening. She then walked to the screen behind her and played a video, a simple loop of Helion 9 taken from orbit in the weeks after the invasion. It showed only dust-broken roads and black smoke, no music, no commentary, just the truth. When the class ended, not a single student left early, not a single question was asked in a rush. Instead, they came forward slowly, respectfully, not to get answers, but to show they had listened truly. Listen, one student left behind a folded note that read, "Thank you for making history." Real again. Mira did not smile, but her chest felt warm in a way it had not in years. Not joy, but peace. Back at the academy, Zarn had taken on leadership in one of the student forums focused on post-war ethics. He had become a voice not of guilt but of learning. He often quoted Mira during his sessions, not as a symbol, but as a source. He told others about the day she removed her armor and how everything changed, not just in the classroom, but in himself. He said truth did not break us, it opened us. One evening, as Mira returned from the assembly campus, she found her old dorm door covered with small pieces of paper, each holding a name, a place, a moment. Survivors from other forgotten battles, students from other planets who had never spoken before, now leaving pieces of their truth on her door. Mira collected them all and placed them in a book, a growing archive, not official, but personal, a map of memory built by the brave and the quiet. Instructor Vex called her in one day with an announcement. The academy was creating a new program focused on conflict memory studies, and they wanted Mira to lead it, not in name only, but in shape, to design it, build it, teach it, guide it from the ground up, a program born not from policy, but from experience. Mira accepted, but with a condition: it must be open to all, not just students, not just scholars, but civilians, survivors, refugees, anyone with truth to share and scars to carry. Vex agreed, and for the first time in academy history, the halls welcomed voices from outside the circle of stars. In her first class under the new program, Mira spoke not about HFY, not about fire or loss or pain. She spoke about healing and how it never looked the same, how some found it in silence, some in rebuilding, some in telling their story again and again until the sting faded and the lesson remained. She told them healing is not forgetting, healing is not moving on, healing is learning to walk while carrying everything that happened and still choosing to take each step. One student, a quiet one from a mining world on the edge of mapped space, asked, "How do you know when you are healed?" Mira paused before answering. "When you stop asking why me and start asking who else needs to be heard." Soon the academy was no longer just a place of learning. It became a place of remembering, of honoring, of rebuilding, not through politics or funding, but through the simple power of truth. Students came to learn, but left changed, not by the books, but by the people they met, by the names they carried, and by the stories they could no longer ignore. The statue of the Peace Guardians now had a second stone placed beside it, smaller, but heavy, engraved with the words, "Memory is the armor of peace," and beneath it Myra's name, not as hero, not as victim, just as truth. Zarn stood beside her one morning as they looked at the stone, the sun rising slowly, casting gold over the silver letters. He asked, "What comes next?" Mira answered, "Someone else tells their story, and someone else listens, and that becomes the next chapter." As the sky brightened and the gardens stirred with life, Mira walked back to her quarters, her armor still hanging on the wall, untouched, but never forgotten. The sound of young cadets echoed down the hall's, laughter and footsteps bouncing off stone, not mocking, not cruel, just young. She smiled slightly, the smallest shift in her lips, because this was what survival had made possible, not revenge, not regret, but a future where scars were not hidden, where truth was not buried, and where silence was no longer the price of peace. And somewhere far across the stars, on a quiet planet once burned and broken, new trees began to grow in soil still healing but alive, because someone had remembered, and that was enough. The stars above the academy shimmered with quiet light spreading across the sky like a blanket of memory, and every night Mira would sit by the window of her quarters and watch them, not counting, not searching, simply remembering. She no longer wore her armor, but she kept it close, not out of fear, not out of habit, but because it was still a part of her, just like the scars and the silence and the story she had carried from Helion 9 to the classroom and beyond. The armor had done its job, and now her words did the rest. The program she helped build had grown beyond the academy. It had reached out across star systems with messages of memory and healing, with lectures shared through lightspeed broadcasts, with refugee voices echoing through stations that had once turned them away. Now students from every species studied not only facts and timelines, but feeling and loss, and what it meant to survive, not as a warrior, but as a witness. Mira was no longer alone in that mission. And that was the change she never thought would come one morning. As Mira walked the corridor toward her next seminar, she noticed something new etched into the walls, words written not in paint or light, but in small metal tiles, each holding a line. Of truth one said wounds are not shame one, said we were not weak one, said we are still here, and together they wrapped around the corridor like a quiet river carrying everything that had once been buried now flowing free. She placed her hand on one of the tiles and stood there, not to read, not to weep, just to feel the truth pressed into stone. Instructor Vex approached from behind and stood beside her, his voice as calm as always, though softer now. We will be naming the main hall after you next week, he said. Mira shook her head gently. Do not name it after me, name it after all of us, the ones who never came back, the ones who did, and the ones still waiting to be heard. Vex gave a small nod and replied, then it shall be called the Hall of Memory, and that will speak louder than any name. The ceremony came quietly, without music, without banners, just a gathering of voices and steps and stillness. Students, teachers, diplomats, refugees, survivors, all standing under the new plaque as Mira stepped forward holding a small stone carved from HFY surface, its color dark, its edges sharp. She placed it beneath the plaque and said these words, no light shines without shadow, no peace holds without pain, no truth lives without witness. And now we witness together. That evening Mira sat at the tree planted long ago when her name was still unknown and her scars still hidden. It had grown taller than the wall, now its roots deep, its leaves full and wide and strong. A bench had been placed nearby, and others often came to sit and think or speak, or simply feel the wind. Mira closed her eyes and listened to the sound of the leaves whispering above her, and imagined her brother sitting beside her, not in grief, not in sorrow, just there. And that thought was enough. A new message arrived days later from the Galactic Peace Assembly, not another lecture, not another debate, but a request, an official request to lead a mission, not of war, not of defense, but of remembrance, a journey to forgotten places across the stars where stories had been buried, where people still lived in silence, where peace had come, but memory had not. Mira read the message twice, then placed her hand on her armor and said softly, I will go. Her ship was small, not made for speed or battle, but for space and time and travel, a memory vessel marked with the seal of the Academy and the crest of HFY beside it. Zarn met her at the docking bay, his face calm, his voice steady. You should not go alone, he said. Mira smiled a little and replied, I never was alone, not really, and now I know how to listen, and listening is how this begins. Together they stepped into the vessel and took their seats as the ship hummed to life, the engines gentle, the lights low, and as they rose from the platform, a small crowd below lifted their hands, not in farewell, but in promise that memory would follow, that truth would echo, that silence would no longer win. Their first stop was a mining colony abandoned after a brief but brutal siege. Mira walked through the dust-covered halls and sat with the remaining few who still lived there, who still remembered. They spoke of nights spent underground, of voices lost in the collapse, of names no one wrote down. Mira listened without blinking, without writing, just remembering. Then she asked, would you like your story told? And they said yes, not because they wanted to be famous, but because they wanted to be real. From there the journey continued to station after station, planet after planet, each holding new pain, old wounds open not from bleeding, but from being forgotten. Mira and Zarn recorded what they heard, shared what they could, and taught others how to keep listening, how to carry truth without breaking under it, how to let silence breathe, but never let it drown the past. In time the mission became more than them. Others joined, survivors who had never spoken, now guiding new teams, voices once silenced, now amplified. Mira watched as it grew, not with control, but with care, like a fire spreading, not to burn, but to warm. She knew the mission would not end, not with her, not with any one person, because memory, once awakened, becomes its own voice, and that voice finds others, and then the silence has no chance. Years passed, and Mira aged not fast, but quietly, her steps slower, her voice deeper, her eyes still bright, her scars still the same, and still she traveled, still she taught, still she sat under trees and listened to those who needed to speak. Zarn stayed by her side, his own story woven into hers, no longer ashamed, no longer just a witness, now a keeper of truth in his own way. One day, on a planet without a name, Mira stood before a crowd of young cadets who had never known war, who had never lost family, who had never hidden in rubble or tasted ash. And she said, I hope you never do, but if you do, you must remember that strength is not in how loud you shout, or how long you fight it is and how deep you carry others and how softly. You protect the stories they trust you with. Afterward, a small girl approached and asked what is peace really. Mira knelt and placed her hand over the girl's heart and said it is this when the heart remembers without hurting, when the truth can rest without hiding, when the next step is not a scream but a song. And then she stood and turned to the stars again. In her final year, she returned once more to the academy, now different, now full of gardens and halls of memory, walls lined with names and windows filled with light. The hall of memory stood tall, and inside her armor was placed in a sealed case, not to be admired, not to be praised, but to be remembered. And beside it a small plaque read, "This is not a symbol of war, it is a shell of survival, and survival means someone lived to speak." And because someone spoke, the silence ended. Mira sat under the Helion tree, one last time, her hand resting on its bark, her eyes closed, her breath slow. She whispered her brother's name once more and felt the wind wrap around her like arms, and in that moment she knew she had done enough. She had turned pain into voice, she had turned scars into seed, she had turned armor into memory. And across the galaxy, in rooms filled with light, in ships flying quiet, in schools built on ash, people remembered, and because they remembered, they did not repeat, and because they did not repeat, the peace held, and because the peace held, Myra's silence could finally rest.